Economic experts in Africa have raised concerns over the rising debt crisis, which is surging at a fast pace. Speaking at the recent International Conference on African Debt Crisis and International Financial Architecture in Accra, Ghana, the stakeholders addressed the role of global financial bodies like the IMF in financing and debt servicing. The conference, which runs for 4 days, is organized by the International Development Economics Associates in Accra, Ghana. News Centre's Adeshewa Udushoga is in Accra, Ghana, and files in this report.
The African continent is grappling with a huge debt crisis, which may be hindering it from adequate access to finance, financing its climate action, achieving its sustainable development goals, and improving its economic growth potential. The continent has continued to be victims of Western economic shocks with rising interest rate and a devalued local currency, which is making it almost impossible to service its debt. Economic and financial experts within and outside the continent have gathered in this room, forming an international conference to discuss the African debt crisis and the international financial architecture.
When you have a problem, the IMF comes and tries to reduce the damage done. But the question is, who was the arsonist in the first place? Okay, this is a problem. You're not going to you cannot control the US in this situation. When the US chooses to raise interest rates, I mean, this current raising of interest rates, was it because of a big problem which needed interest rates to be raised? No, it was because the US Federal Reserve Bank wanted to discipline organized labor.
We need to understand as Africans that nobody owes us a living.
During the conference, a spotlight was shed on countries in the Sahel region, bounded by a common currency of the CFA franc. Conversations around how the CFA franc is keeping the countries poor and the need to exit and establish an alternative currency were brought to the fore.
We'll have to either reform the systems or transitioning out. And that's the debate we have now. And how do we ensure that the transition is smooth, not chaotic, but result into a system that deliver on expected growth dividend that people are waiting for and looking for, is the main challenge. And there's been a lot of discussion in the past, and you heard today that one aspect will be to make sure that we have enough reserve, foreign reserve, as a caution.
Or is it an impossible association?
The speakers at the event who spoke in turns highlighted what they tagged as the unwarranted role of the global financial bodies like the IMF in debt restructuring for African countries and how it is designed to keep the continent indebted with a rising interest rate.
We've got to figure out a way of insulating our own currencies from dependence on the US dollar, which is something that I think the new Senegalese president, for example, is trying to sort of think about. So these I see as a way, as kind of solutions way forward.
As part of the numerous resolutions, speakers here are urging African leaders to exploit their respective natural resources as a source for foreign reserves, form a continent-based financial body, and a common currency that reflects its macroeconomics, amongst others. In Accra, Ghana, for News Central, Adeshewa Udushoga.
The debt crisis in Africa is rising at a worrisome and exponential pace, with the constant rise in the value of foreign currency against local currencies and an increasing level of interest rates. With numerous interconnected economic crises, economists on the continent are now calling for a major structural adjustment at a recent conference by the International Development Economics Associates in Accra, Ghana. The conference, which will run for 4 days, seeks to address African debt crisis and reform of the international financial architecture. And joining me on the news to discuss this is News Central's correspondent, Adeshewa Udushoga. Adeshewa, thank you so much for availing yourself at this time. So kindly tell us, what is the focus of this conference and what problems are they looking to solve? That is the discussants and the participants there.
Of 1996, which was followed All right, Lakon, thank you so much for having me on the news. Now, the focus of this conference is to address the current debt crisis happening on the African continent. As a matter of fact, 24 out of 55 African countries are currently faced with an imminent debt crisis, which is affecting the economic development and growth of these nations. And then, from what we have gathered, the panelists at the summit are addressing the root causes of this debt crisis. From what we know is that most of these African countries will seek debt from the U.S. Federal Reserve, saying that it is becoming almost impossible to service this debt as a result of the rising interest rate. We recall that the U.S. Federal Reserve increased its interest rate by, 2 years ago at a point where it is becoming almost impossible for these African countries to pay back their loans. And then also the current devaluation of the local currencies in these African countries makes it impossible, for these African countries to, pay back these loans, which often comes in foreign currencies. And also, part of the deliberations here are that the role that the International Monetary Fund, that's or the global financial body IMF, is playing in debt servicing, and we know that this debt crisis is affecting the access to finance for African countries. It's also affecting financing its climate actions, and also the ability to be able to reach the sustainable development goals for 2030. And also, we also understand that there is a call to prevent a repeat of the 1980 scenario, where we understand that the U.S. Federal Reserve raised its key interest rates, just like we have it now, and its commodity prices, and this reflected on the export earnings in African countries, which declined exponentially. And then also that experienced the financial markets, the position of the exchange rate, and then they say that if this continues to happen, if more African countries continues to be unable to finance its debt as a result of the structures that's laid down by the global financial bodies, and then also the Western economies like the US, the France, Germany, and the likes, Africa might forever be indebted to these Western countries, and then it might also affect, like I said earlier, its access to financing its climate actions, reaching sustainable goals for 2030, and as well as aiding the economic growth and development amidst the external shocks that is currently happening, which can be linked to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war that is having its impact on these African countries. We also know that most of these countries, there was a crash in the global oil prices, and then this affected the foreign reserves of these countries, making it impossible to pay back their loans, which interest rate has doubled over the years. And then the deliberations at the summit by stakeholders is that Africa should begin to look inward into its natural resources to be the primary source for its foreign reserves in order to be able to finance it, to service its debt.
Okay, Adeshowa Odushoga, thank you so much for the in-depth updates you just gave to us. We'll continue to keep tabs with you in the update to come. Thank you so much. The news continues in West Africa, where African economists are seeking alternative external debt restructuring templates to redirect the current debt burdens on the continent to a sustainable level for a smooth recovery and economic growth. They made this call at the end of the 3-day international conference on Africa debt crisis in Accra, Ghana. News Central's Adeshowa Odushoga reports.
As the International Conference on Africa Debt Crisis winds up in Accra, Ghana, the takeaways from the speakers here are focused on the alternative external debt restructuring template. And as we know, debt restructuring is necessary to bring debt burdens back to sustainable levels and limit the negative impact of greater debt servicing on what is already a fragile socio-economic environment like we have in African countries.
We've proposed quite a number of different elements. For instance, the issue of the involvement of the multilateral development banks in debt restructuring, the issue of the participation of private creditors in debt restructuring, both are not really binding,
Debt restructuring is a sovereign decision. Thus, the panel conversation highlights the options available to African countries and set out a number of key recommendations to guide countries and strengthen the continental debt restructuring framework.
Debt relief is essential, and all classes of debt, to the extent that they can actually be included, should be on the table, right, including multilateral debt. Second, innovations that can help African countries to not only improve debt sustainability, but also address their pressing development needs in terms of financing that is necessary for development and also for climate.
When the IMF comes to any individual country and looks at whether or not it can sustain its debt, it does this exercise called a debt sustainability analysis. It looks at GDP growth, looks at exports, and it says how much debt can this country actually carry. But a key part of how much debt it can carry depends on what the IMF is assuming that the government will do with its budget policies.
Economists here agreed on few things, and that's the fact that choices and approaches regarding public debt restructuring are mainly influenced by country-specific factors, which includes the national debt profile, the prevailing macroeconomic conditions, the structure of the domestic economy, and the political and economic considerations of the country in question. In Accra, Ghana, for News Central, Adeshawa Odushoga.
Africa's debt crisis has taken center stage in recent years, highlighting the economic challenges faced by many countries across the continent. While discussions mostly revolve around the socio-economic impact, experts believe there's another critical impact that demands attention: the potential threat to environmental sustainability and conservation efforts in Africa.
It's very difficult for Africans, including in Zimbabwe, to do this without adequate financing to support it. And without that adequate financing, why is that financing inadequate? In Zimbabwe, there are special problems with the history and the macro problems in Zimbabwe itself. More broadly across the continent, it's because debt is too high. Countries which already have too much debt say to themselves, I already have too much, do I really want to take on some more? Even if it's going to support the environment. So a key part of solving this conundrum, which is to preserve what there is in the environment and to support it, is a fully formed program of debt relief for Africa so that it can finance these projects within its debt capacity, ability to carry.
Others felt reduced financial capacity affected the ability to invest in renewable energy infrastructure, climate resilience projects, and sustainable agriculture practices.
So the first concern is just the quantum of financing going to climate adaptation, right? So our major needs are not in mitigation because we're low greenhouse gas emitters, they're in adaptation. But 95% of financing flows go to mitigation, right? So there's a need to improve the flows that are going to adaptation in order to help African countries build more resilience, right?
Meanwhile, concerns have also risen regarding the ethical implications of multinational corporations evading their tax responsibilities.
I think there need to be a kind of good negotiation with those corporations to say that if you want to import, if you want to explore the national resources or the kind of minerals, oil, you need to transfer certain technology. And for our governments, we need to, for instance, for oil, we need processed oil to a certain percentage. You cannot get all the benefits, not only oil, but also for other commodities. You need to have certain amount of the production be based in the country and need to transfer technology.
Sustainable debt management strategies that take into account the preservation of Africa's rich natural heritage are crucial for securing a better future both economically and environmentally for the continent. Yokaita Zira, NRTV News, Accra, Ghana.
Making business news, the International Conference on African Debt Crisis and the Financial Architecture, which is bringing together economists and experts to discuss the complex challenges faced by African countries in managing their debt burdens, has opened in Accra, Ghana. Our reporter Yokaita Zira is attending the conference and filed the following report.
According to economists, the key factors contributing to the accumulation of debt in African nations include corruption, currency instability, domestic debt, and excessive taxation. The consensus among conference panelists here is that understanding these factors in their interplay can help authorities to devise effective strategies to alleviate the debt crisis and promote sustainable economic development in Africa.
We cannot be going around with begging bowl from one generation to the other, looking for help, when we are the most endowed continent in the world. And if we wake up to that realization, if we wake up to the fact that enough is enough, we cannot continue with this cycle, then you can begin to take the necessary measures to break the structures of your dependence. First of all, why do you produce raw materials which you don't process? Why do you export more capital from Africa to the rest of the world and then go begging to borrow pittance, which is then used to oppress you even more?
Other economists felt there was need for unity amongst African governments in the debt resolution process.
But this is precisely why unity of purpose, not just among African countries, but also beyond, to ensure that you have a strong enough counter cartel, because the lenders are a cartel or a cabal, as we heard today. So you need to be able to counter them effectively, and you need to be able to build coalitions, find friends in order to do so.
The need for African economies to industrialize and push for mass exportation as a way of insulating themselves from debt was also emphasized.
So the way forward, first of all, is to think about how do we insulate our countries from commodity price swings. One thing we need to do is to start to export manufactured goods. We need to start to industrialize our economies. That way we can insulate our economies from these vagaries of up and down swings. The second thing that we need to do is to think seriously about how do we finance infrastructure. I mean, you people are not sort of alien to the idea that our cities are under supplied by infrastructure, right? We have no roads, we have no bridges, very few hospitals, water doesn't work, electricity sometimes doesn't work, so we need to fix this infrastructure gap.
The African debt crisis is a multifaceted issue that requires a comprehensive approach to address its underlying causes. Analysts contend that in order to alleviate the debt crisis and promote sustainable economic development, African nations must prioritize good governance, strengthen institutions, implement debt management frameworks, and pursue sound fiscal policies. Furthermore, international cooperation, debt relief initiatives, and investment in productive sectors could help support African countries' efforts to achieve debt sustainability and unlock their full economic potential. Yokaita Zira, NRTV News, Accra, Ghana.
As efforts continue to find ways of tackling Africa's debt crisis, it has emerged that women and young girls are bearing a disproportionate burden of the crisis as it impacts on African economies' growth. This has led to calls by global experts for the urgent need of interventions to lower the burden on women. Our reporter Yokaita Zira has more details.
Some global economic experts felt that the African debt crisis had a negative impact on women and young girls, and that insufficient investment in the education sector, driven by budget constraints and debt repayment obligations, had resulted in inadequate resources for schools and limited educational opportunities.
A debt crisis is not just a debt crisis. A debt crisis is a development crisis. And it's a development crisis for multiple reasons. One reason, of course, is the fact that if you have accumulated over a period of time, because of your subordinate position within the international order, if you accumulated a large amount of debt, a significant share of your budget actually goes to paying the interest and amortization on your debt. So if you're going to actually have to allocate more to that, you have less left to undertake a set of expenditures, which are social expenditures, social protection expenditures, expenditures of the kinds which in societies, most societies in which women tend to take on roles which actually make up for the fact that there's inadequate protection of care by the state for children, for the elderly, etc., that if your social protection expenditures come down, then you end up with a situation where the burden on women increases. Young girls are requested to take on roles very early in life, which they shouldn't be when they're going to school.
Another economist also weighed in.
It's very important that we analyze it from this gendered dimension, because the risk is that we have a huge regression in the advancement of women and girls' rights on the continent, and accessing of economic, education and social opportunities for women and girls as a result of this debt crisis, where governments are spending more money on debt servicing than they are in investing in social sectors.
Others felt addressing the gendered impact of Africa's debt crisis required comprehensive policy interventions.
Curb debts accumulation. That's the big message here, and how to do this as much as possible, mobilize resources domestically, and if you're drawing from a bigger pool in terms of revenue, a bigger revenue base, you will now have more finance to invest in women and girls' priorities.
Africa's debt crisis has had a detrimental impact on women and young girls, impeding their access to healthcare and education. The limited opportunities for education and inadequate healthcare provision perpetuate gender disparities, limit economic empowerment, and perpetuate cycles of poverty. Addressing these challenges requires concerted efforts from governments, international organizations, and civil societies to prioritize gender-responsive policies and investments.
Zimbabwe is making efforts to clear debt from international financial institutions, with the debt clearing process being championed by the African Development Bank President Akinwumi Adesina and former Mozambican President Joaquim Chissano. The nation's national consolidated debts currently stand at $17.5 United States billion. Our reporter Yaokaita Zira, who is currently in Ghana for an international conference on African debt crisis and the international financial architecture, caught up with the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development Executive Director, Mr. Jason Braganza, to discuss the issue.
All right, so Jason, what are your thoughts about Zimbabwe's current efforts to settle its debt through the debt clearance plan?
I think it's a very welcome initiative that the government and the African Development Bank, together with the sponsor, His Excellency Chissano, have taken and embarked on to try and get and create some fiscal space within Zimbabwe. As we all know, the economic and social conditions as a result of the impending debts that need to be paid have had a significant negative impact on the lives of many Zimbabweans, and coupled with international crises that are currently going on, things like cost of living, the quality of life is likely to deteriorate. So I think the attempt by the government of Zimbabwe to sit down with its creditors, particularly the bilateral creditors, and see how they can restructure and reorganize this arrears clearance program is very much welcome. It's a very complicated process, of course, because there are different interests that are at play during these negotiations. But I do feel that the attempt, at least by the government, to sit down and have this conversation is a step in the right direction. I also should say that the role the African Development Bank has played in this regard in facilitating the conversations between the government of Zimbabwe and the bilateral creditors is also very welcome, and the role that it's playing in facilitating these negotiations and these conversations can only bode well, not only for the government of Zimbabwe, but hopefully in the medium term for the people as well of Zimbabwe, in trying to create more fiscal space for the government to access and generate more resources that can then feed into into the National Development Strategy 1 that was launched last year, and actually keep the country on track towards achieving the objectives and the goals that have been set out in the NDS1.
Some critics have pointed out that Zimbabwe should abandon this debt clearance plan since it does not have the funds to do so. What should Zimbabwe do since it cannot access new loans from international financial institutions?
I think we have to be careful when we talk about the government of Zimbabwe not having funds to deal with this arrears clearance program. Remember, the idea is that it's a negotiation, and a negotiation means that there's going to be give and take. On the one hand, yes, there are some of the creditors will just have to accept that some of the debt that is owed to them might be reduced, it might be rescheduled, or what they call reprofiled and reclassified, so that the payment terms are readjusted accordingly. And the idea around the arrears clearance program or discussion is that you want to create the space where the government of Zimbabwe can then generate money. So it will be able to generate money to then fund its development agenda. The caution, I would say, that many of us are discussing and advocating for is that we should not see the fiscal space that is going to be created from this program as an opportunity to access loans. Because what's going to happen is that the risk is we repeat the cycle of the Zimbabwean government entering into more debt. What we want is for this arrears clearance program to stimulate some type of domestic economic and productive activity in which then the government can collect revenues domestically, and that can potentially create a positive cycle.
In business tonight, scholars, policy analysts, think tanks and civil society groups have converged in Accra, Ghana to step up calls for the restructuring of the global financial ecosystem to provide relief for economies grappling with debt distress. This comes in the wake of default on sovereign debt by Ethiopia, Ghana and Zambia. Let's now take a look at some of the proposals. It is the second day of the International Conference on Africa's Debt Crisis taking place in Accra, Ghana, and policymakers, scholars and think tanks are calling for a rethink of the global financial architecture to ensure that economies which fall into distress, especially those in low-income countries in Africa, are given reprieve from the burden of servicing debt obligations.
We have moved from a predominance of official multilateral loans to tide over our situations of crisis to a dependence on much more private financing.
Governments are prioritizing the repayment of external debt, mainly at unsustainable levels, and renegotiating domestic debt in ways that are creating livelihood crisis for domestic holders of government paper.
Stakeholders present at the conference laid emphasis on case studies from countries which have gone into default, especially Ethiopia and Zambia, calling for urgent measures to be taken up to ensure that African countries are spared the burden that comes with falling into debt distress and the protracted process of debt restructuring.
Countries like Ethiopia cannot afford to put all their money on debt servicing. So what we propose to the government of Ethiopia is a cap on debt servicing and a ring fencing of social expenditures.
Zambia is still hanging in the balance. There was a talk yesterday about, having reached a deal with the private creditors. But that is very tentative. It depends on the official creditors.
So far, 3 countries in Africa have defaulted on debt. That's Ghana, Zambia, and Ethiopia, and the hope remains that there will be no other economies coming into such positions because of the complexities it does precipitate for the citizens and the economy. Right behind me you have visibility of the Freedom and Justice Monument at the heart of Accra in Ghana. 37 degrees centigrade here, pretty hot. A month ago, Business Redefined came to you from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. This time, we are all the way in West Africa in Accra, Ghana. The commonality between these 2 economies, that's Ghana and Ethiopia is that both have defaulted and are in the process of debt restructuring. This episode is dedicated to one question. Is there a fundamental problem with the global financial architecture, debt distress, and the process of resolution? The second leg to that question is this: can there be found an alternative template to how we go about the process of debt resolution in the event that an economy falls into distress, especially those from the global south? Presently, the sentiment is the debtor countries are subjected to punitive requirements and the waiting out of each other by the creditors due to the requirement of comparability of treatment. Let's explore this.
On the 19th of December 2022, Ghana announced the suspension of payments on Eurobonds, commercial term loans, and most of its bilateral debt. Effectively, the economy had defaulted on its debt and would then begin undertaking the long and daunting process of debt restructuring. The country would go further and default on its domestic debt.
Under the domestic exchange program, domestic bond holders will be asked to exchange their instruments for new ones. Existing domestic bonds as of 1st December 2022 will be exchanged for a set of 4 new bonds maturing in 2027, 2029, 2032, and 2037. The annual coupon on all these new bonds will be set at 0% in 2023, 5% in 2024, and 10% from 2025 until maturity.
With the restructuring of its domestic debt, Ghana saw a rise in protests by persons affected, notably pensioners who, after much clamor, were eventually coalesced under the Pension Bondholders Forum and were spared a haircut, which essentially means a reduction in their expected payments. The situation has not been any different for Zambia in Southern Africa, which went into default on November 13, 2020. It was only after 3 years and 4 months that Zambia has managed to ink a deal with its creditors on how to restructure $3.5 billion worth of debt. The reality of a protracted and arduous debt distress resolution process has seen a rise in the debate as to whether the world can find an alternative template to debt restructuring and how this template should look like. At a conference on Africa's debt crisis this March in Accra, Ghana, this matter took center stage.
Governments are prioritizing the repayment of external debt, mainly at unsustainable levels, and renegotiating domestic debt in ways that are creating livelihood crises for domestic holders of government paper, with ramifications across households in Africa. This leaves very little in the government budget for serious projects of structural transformation, which require huge investments in rural infrastructure, social sectors production, and social reproduction. Some of the national institutions and individuals affected by domestic debt restructuring are key non-state actors in social provisioning and social protection, and this has ramifications for the social conditions of numerous citizens who depend on them. The situation has clear dangers for the social fabric and for national cohesion.
You have domestic savers required to bail in the debtor by accepting domestic debt restructuring, which has become now common. Of course, Zambia didn't have it, but Ghana had it, Sri Lanka had it. Both of them have implemented it in different forms, but implemented it. And the whole point is, I mean, the evidence is clear that if you have this kind of austerity, you're contracting the level of GDP, so that if you set a target, let's say for external debt to GDP, it's going to be difficult to achieve that given what's happening to the denominator, as it was pointed out by somebody. But also, these policies do not get to two things. One is the fact that you are chronically deficit countries and therefore need policy space to be able to correct that, otherwise you're going to have the same thing. You have the HIPC initiative, you have an MDRI, and still you have the same countries getting into another debt crisis because of these chronic deficits.
I'm right in front of the Ministry of Finance in Ghana. Now, this is the government agency which has been right at the heart of negotiation with creditors as far as the restructuring of their debt is concerned. Now, Ghana's case is unique because not only have they restructured external debt, they have also gone as far as restructuring domestic debt, and that has precipitated a lot of issues in this country. Now, the elephant in the room with any restructuring process is the question of the haircut. Who forgoes, what amount, and at what time? And that has been the basis of the conversation we have been having right here in Accra around, is there a challenge or a need for a rethink of how we go about haircuts and which creditors take the haircut in the event of a debt restructuring process?
I plead guilty. I was on the World Bank side of the DSAs for a number of years, and I've realized that the DSAs have a major conceptual problem. They are plagued by an over-optimism bias. The over-optimism bias has to do with exaggerated projections of growth, some of them sent by the governments also. Two is that they do not incorporate climate shock. Three, the DSAs are done secretly and the private creditors are not involved. So the amount of the analysis, what Jayati Ghosh said yesterday, I'm in full compliance, full agreement with, the DSAs systematically underestimate the haircut that is needed for countries to go to a stable solvency situation. They treat the common framework is like what in high school we learned, the Holy Roman Empire. It's not holy, it's not Roman, it's not an empire. The common framework has nothing in common and there's no framework.
We have an interesting also graphic there showing the dynamics around the restructuring of debt, the negotiating with the different creditors. And as you can see from that maze there, that this is a nightmare. You don't know where you are. You're really going in circles, back and forth, back and forth. And up to now, Zambia is still hanging in the balance. You don't know whether China will accept. There was a talk yesterday about, having reached a deal with the private creditors. But that is very tentative. It depends on the official creditors, because the main problem is that the official creditors are objecting to the terms that the country is agreeing with the private creditors. And this comparability of treatment is in itself, just an unviable principle, because the different dates are negotiated under different conditions. To treat them similarly or commonly is going to be a huge nightmare, and we'll see a lot of setbacks.
If you're trying to build an alternative template, haircuts are crucial. I mean, there's no way. This is unsustainable debt. We've seen it before. We'll have to do it again. So negotiations must be based on some transparent estimates of haircuts, which must be based on a multilaterally defined idea of comparability of treatment. The IMF in its DSA cannot implicitly have a definition of comparability of treatment and say, oh, this is the way it's going to work, because finally you're going to negotiate terms and it's going to break down, which happened in Zambia, for example. Third, MDBs must be included, because that is the only way you can get the advanced market economies to share a part of the burden of adjustment, since they don't have too much in the bilateral kitty. Much of their money goes through the multilateral kitty. Fourth, we should recognize that the IMF is not a neutral technocratic player. So, evidence, look at the level of haircuts. Sri Lanka, it was pointed out, 30% haircut. What is 30% haircut when Sri Lankan bonds were trading at 40 cents to $1? That is 60% already the market is defined for you.
One cannot discuss Africa's prevailing debt crisis and the need for debt restructuring without a mention of China. The giant Asian economy has risen over the years to be the continent's largest bilateral creditor, extending a staggering $170 billion worth of loans to the continent over the last 2 decades. China's lending has been largely infrastructure focused, and at the conference in Accra, one of the issues which emerged is the pressing need for a unified voice on how African economies go about debt restructuring negotiations with China and other creditors.
Is China the global south or the global north? And the question I'm going to ask is, China gives debt to Ethiopia, Exim Bank gives at 3% and calls itself an official creditor. China Development Bank gives at 6% and calls it a private creditor. The Ethiopian government official told me we are negotiating with different parts of the Chinese government. How do you get A, a consolidated Chinese position, B, Chinese willingness to see Africa's problem as a problem of solvency, not of liquidity? The common framework was designed not as HIPC, but as a framework to give maturity extensions. Only in extreme cases do they say solvency is the problem. But we know from looking at the data that solvency is a much more serious problem. It's not only liquidity. Even for Ethiopia, I believe they have serious solvency problems.
If you look at bilateral official debt, it has been really declined. For Africa, it's about 23%. And for China, it's about 10 to 12%. So this kind of narrative given or prescribed or described in the mass media is not really correct, because it's a kind of geopolitics overshadowing the intellectual objectivity. China came in to lend quite a great deal to the African continent. Yesterday someone talked about, I won't repeat, but it was mostly for infrastructure and some of the productive and other things.
People keep asking, should there be an Accra club and so on? I think there should be an African Union club, and it should say, its campaign should be, when the IMF runs debt sustainability analyses, it should not set medium-term primary balances above the target band. That is a way of African Union insisting that the IMF follow best practice.
At the end of March in 2024, Zambia finally, after an arduous and prolonged process, inked a deal with its Eurobond creditors on the restructuring of its debt, $3 billion worth. That has taken about 4 years, and the question that is being asked is the economy we are currently in, that is Ghana, you can see the flag right behind me in the background. The question is whether Ghana can equally ink a deal, and why in the first place is the resolution with the Eurobond creditors taking 3 or 4 years, and can that be accelerated? We sought to explore the answer to this question.
Very little attention was paid to the terms of the loans. The drive a lot of times was simply to get the loans and to be able to present this to the public as a success story. Very little attention was paid to the developmental content of the loans, what developmental outcomes were sought in contracting those loans. In fact, scandalously, in many countries, those loans were taken to finance consumption, simply to finance consumption in a lot of cases. And even if they were not initially contracted to finance consumption, we found that in too many of the countries, the loans were simply redirected precisely to finance consumption. So there was really no developmental content or benefit associated with the Eurobond loans that were being contracted.
We've talked a lot about the current debt landscape, and we can see it's quite different, and also debt restructuring, they are quite different from several decades ago. One important thing I would like to highlight here is the large size, the magnitude of the debt owned by developing countries. If you think back to the HAPIC days, the entire debt relief for 36 countries was only 76 billion US dollars, and that was a comprehensive debt relief. And right now, if you look at African debt alone, it accounts to about 1.2 or 1.3 trillion US dollars. So the larger size of debt owned by developing countries itself makes debt restructuring very difficult. You need to have greater amount of liquidity. Of course, you also have the problem of debt composition, which many people talked about in the past 2 days. For instance, if you look at African debt, 43% is owed to private sectors and about 34% owed to multilateral institutions. So these two combined constitute about 80% of the total African debt, which means debt restructuring, you must, as Chang Zhuo mentioned just now, and many others mentioned in the past 2 days, that you must involve the multilateral development banks, even though they have enjoyed the kind of special status.
It's abundantly clear that the international financial architecture is failing Africa. Part of the problem is that the IMF, which is at the center of it, is not able to be a neutral party. So we are proposing UN or some other body to be able to be a repository, A, for all the information on debt of countries, B, of trying to reconcile claims between China and the multilaterals and others, because the IMF is very, officially they can't say it, but de facto rescuing private creditors is part of the IMF MO.
One of the countries which has stolen the headlines in 2024 as far as debt restructuring is concerned is Kenya, because of course it had the single largest maturity, $2 billion of a bullet payment due in June 2024. Now that was up until February this year because Kenya went into the market and was able to refinance using a new Eurobond, $1.5 billion. But the question that has emerged is whether Kenya paid too steep a price to be able to sidestep the default that countries like Ghana and Zambia and Ethiopia have fallen into.
Other countries which are not doing debt restructuring but are in programs, I'm going to quote the case of Kenya. Kenya's tried very hard to avoid a default, but in so doing, the IMF has steadily increased the medium-term primary balance target that Kenya has to hit, which is why every Kenyan tax is going up and up and up. It's now at the point, according to this analysis, where I would say Kenya is on the cusp where the right thing for it to do is default and to go into a restructuring to get its medium term done. Kenya and Zambia have a key thing in common. As you mentioned, there's a big celebration that Kenya managed to refinance its bonds recently. Yay, we avoided a default at this price. The price is not the interest rate that you had to pay, which was very high, on that refinance Eurobond. It's also the fact that you have accepted that your medium-term primary balance target is now above the band, compromising Kenya's medium-term growth. And exactly the same point applies to Zambia. There have been celebrations in the past few days. Yay, Zambia's got to deal with its creditors on a primary balance target which is above the band. You should not just celebrate the deal, you should celebrate a good deal. And on this measure, Zambia does not have a good deal.
I am 80% sympathetic to debtors. I understand one creditor concern, which is when HIPIC was done, it was thought to be a one-time. There's African governments that have spent the money well and African governments that have mismanaged the money. How do we differentiate between the two? And the question is, the rate at which African governments borrowed was 5-6% at a time when capital was very, very cheap in the world. And their investment returns have been 1-2%. In Ethiopia, they invested in industrial parks, sugar companies, and many of these projects have not come to maturity. Many of these projects have not delivered. Is there a problem on the borrower side, on the financial modeling, on how you use the money? Even assume there's a haircut. How do we assume in 10 years we don't have a third debt crisis?
Credit rating is terribly, terribly important for these countries. If you recall, the DSSI initiative under G20, 73 countries were eligible, but only about 48 countries used DSSI. It's not because they don't need the money, it's because they were afraid that once they tapped into DSSI, their credit rating will be downgraded. Even though in the process, credit rating agencies announced very clearly, if you only touch upon official bilateral lenders, you don't touch private sectors, the rating will be maintained at the same level. Still, not all countries applied to use DSSI. So here, it shows that debt restructuring is becoming also much more difficult because the reliance on the international capital market and the fear of the credit rating agencies.
That takes us to the close of this episode of Business Redefined, where we have been talking about the subject of debt distress and restructuring. And the question has been whether we have an alternative template which can be used to help countries resolve their debt distress. We continue to put a focus on this subject as developments happen to bring you the latest as it unfolds. Stay tuned.
The International Development Economics Associates and the African Forum Network have called for a new financial architecture to address debt crisis in Africa during the 2024 African Debt Crisis Conference in Accra on Thursday, March 28. Here's more.
Day 2 of the international conference held in Accra projected how some African countries have accumulated debts in a fast pace. Professor Mma Ekuruchi is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of Economies of Africa. Speakers during the conference proposed the age restructuring process as the only way to walk out of our debts. They said recent findings proves that if more credit rating agencies are objective in their analysis, they can save African countries about $74.5 billion, which is significant in terms of development.
And joining me via Zoom is Professor C.P. Chandreska, Head Research and Policy at IDEAS, and a Professor of Economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, and Professor Yusufan Lee, Senior Advisor on South-South Cooperation and Development Finance at South Center tonight. Good evening to you too, sir, and welcome to this night. Good evening to you and welcome to this night.
Thank you very much.
Right, great to have you here. Now, Let me start with you, Prof. Mr. Andreska. Why has Ideas convened their conference on debt crisis now? Let us understand why it is so important.
Well, the reason we've convened it now, it's because of the fact that if you take the period from the end of 2020 to the first quarter of 2023, for which we have data from some of the rating agencies, you look at the number of defaults that we've had across the world, and of course a large number of them in Africa. The number of defaults are in the range of about 14 defaults, default events. But if you take the period from 2012 to 2022, you actually have a total of 19, which basically means that there is, in the context of a rising vulnerability because of the shocks which came as a result of COVID, which came as a result of the Ukraine invasion, and now comes as a result of the increase in interest rates in the United States and elsewhere, that these countries are now teetering on the brink of a crisis, which is not just a debt crisis, but a development crisis. And they are finding it near impossible within the current international financial architecture to resolve it. And we are really here to try develop an alternative template which developing countries as a group, particularly those which are debt stressed or facing a debt crisis, that they will be able to actually present this as an alternative to those which are being pushed by the IMF, which don't work.
Now, again, Prof, on the role of International Monetary Fund, IMF, Ghana is presently under the IMF program. Can you tell us more about the implications of these sorts of agreements and what would be a better alternative?
Well, the difficulty with the IMF type of restructuring is, one is, of course, the IMF comes with a little bit of money, which is bridge finance, which is trying to tell you that at the end of it, they would be able to restructure the debt which is owed to bilateral creditors, which is the governments which are lent to you, including a range of governments within what's called the Paris Club creditors, and as well as get you some money, one from the multilateral development banks, plus finally, most importantly, to restructure the large volume of debt which have been provided by private creditors, namely the commercial banks and the bondholders. Now, what we know is that this was associated with a program which involves a significant degree of imposition of austerity on the population, which was not responsible for this debt crisis. And this imposition of austerity is accompanied by an effort to directly take away the savings of poor people by actually saying that you should restructure domestic debt. You actually have a situation, fortunately, in Ghana where commercial bank credit owed to which the government owns to the commercial banks, they've found that needs to be done. They've been forced not to restructure the credit of pension holders. But still, we do know that people have savings in commercial banks. Commercial banks can get into difficulties as they have in the past. And this can affect depositors who would be called to bail in as opposed to bail out commercial banks. So that would be very bad from the point of view of the savings and the functioning of these savers. So you're going to have this deep austerity. But at the end of it, what we know is even today, we do not have, let alone in Ghana, not in Zambia, not in Sri Lanka, we haven't had the IMF being able to deliver an actual restructuring, particularly of private creditor debt. So you pay with austerity, but you still do not get a viable restructuring which can put you on a sustainable growth trajectory. And we think that this is because of the fact that the IMF represents the interests of private global finance and not of the countries it is claiming that it's seeking to help.
Now, let me speak to you, Professor Nehru. Looking at where Ghana stands as a country, can countries like Ghana ever get out of or return from its debt? Is it possible?
I think for Ghana, we can see there are many reasons leading to the debt crisis. For instance, regarding taxation system, the collection of taxation and also the tax incentives sometimes might not be optimal. And of course, there is also the problem of not having increased productivity, which means the borrowed money and investment was not turned to productive sectors. In the end, you would have less current account surplus,
and actually you suffered from current account deficit. And also you don't have sufficient physical space because of the reduced revenue. And of course, the continuous increased borrowing through the euro bonds and also through other bilateral borrowings have increased the borrowing cost and also the debt servicing cost, which really drained the government revenue and leading to significant difficulty in debt servicing. And it becomes very severe when the government was cut off from international capital market, I think probably for 2 years, and that made the rolling over debt became very, very difficult. And there was only one way, and that had to go to the IMF for bridging financing, which Chandra mentioned just now. And with that, in order to get the bridging finance, you have to go through the IMF program. So this kind of the problems and the kind of steps that the government has to go through is something that we are facing at this moment.
Prof, let me stay with you, Prof. Enero. Let me stay with you and ask you this very quick one. It is presently hot in Ghana, bringing attention to the concerns about climate change. What are some of the linkages between the debt crisis and climate change?
Well, I think there is a very clear linkage, especially for Ghana.
Right.
And I think Ghana is a victim of climate change because you suffer from overheating, you suffer from drought, you suffer from various kind of climate change induced calamities, which actually reduced the agricultural harvest and also affected other productivity. So that created a kind of burden on the revenue and the productivity of the government. And meanwhile, when you have reduced revenue, you have less money to pay the debt. So in the end, climate change debt becomes a kind of vicious cycle. So that's the reason why many academia and also policymakers have been insisting that for the IMF debt sustainability analysis, you must have to take into climate change as a part of the equation. And we haven't really implemented the enhanced DSA yet. But for Ghana, this is certainly a big, big problem, I think.
Welcome back. An associate professor at the Nordic African Institute, Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, has bemoaned how African countries go around with begging bowls from one generation to another, looking for help when the continent is the most endowed. Speaking at an International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance conference, he stated it's about time the narrative is changed with strong fiscal discipline.
The Ideas International Conference on African Debt Crisis and International Financial Architecture, held on Wednesday, March 27, accommodated prominent dignitaries within the African space to share ideas on needed reforms to recover lost economic decades. Here is the guest speaker and associate professor at the Nordic African Institute, Professor Adebayo Olukoshi.
Because in fact, in quite a number of African countries, governors of central banks and ministers of finance were themselves shareholders or owners of consultancy companies that benefited directly from the Eurobond loans that were taken by their countries, almost in a context, in a situation of conflict of interest that effectively meant that loans were taken in order to achieve personal enrichment. Loans were taken unjustified in order to get the percentage that was necessary. And, you know, you can Google some of the stories that have come out in recent times. The Nigerian finance minister, Nigeria is going through a very severe crisis. Chair, it's, you know, Ghana has surprised a lot of us, but Ghana is not exceptional in this regard.
He asserted that the current debt crisis affecting many African countries has a lot of similarities with the debt crisis of the 1980s.
The current debt crisis affecting many African countries has a lot of similarities with the debt crisis of the 1980s, but also some important differences. In the 1970s, leading to the 80s, our external debts were mostly with official creditors. A lot of them organized in the so-called Paris Club of Creditors. And to the extent to which there was any other lending that took place outside of the bilateral creditors, it came from the multilateral institutions, namely the IMF and the World Bank.
In his view, a crucial awakening is necessary to discontinue the borrowing cycle and seek a path of financial self-sufficiency.
The time has come, first of all, to stop behaving as if we are a people who have no shame. We cannot be going around with begging bowl from one generation to the other, looking for help, when we are the most endowed continent in the world. And if we wake up to that realization, if we wake up to the fact that enough is enough, we cannot continue with this cycle, then you can begin to take the necessary measures to break the structures of your dependence.
And as we wrap up on foreign affairs today, we also leave you with a conversation with Jose Antonio. He's the former finance minister for Colombia. He's here in Ghana having a conversation with experts on reforming the international financial architecture. Jose Antonio, thank you for talking to Joy News. How is Accra treating you, first of all, and Akwaba? That's our way of welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much. It has been very nice to be here, and of course the discussion is a complex one, to put it simply, given the problems of sub-Saharan Africa in relation to debt issues, but also the lack of a global institutional framework to manage the current situation. And let me say, of course, it's a problem of sub-Saharan Africa, but it's also a problem of developing countries. I mean, you can say let's say the situation of Sri Lanka, for example, which has been also very critical in Asia, and in my continent, Latin America, Argentina and Ecuador.
And of course, you have immense experience having served with the United Nations and working on all of these common challenges we face across the world. But more prominent is the case of Africa, because you know, it's a fact that the continent is in crisis, with many countries having a sovereign debt crisis. Just at the last African Union summit, heads of states were dialoguing on the possible way out. That's because the figures are not too good. You take a look at, for instance, the percentage of our export earnings as compared to our foreign debt is hovering way beyond 140%. Jose, what's your own diagnosis of the problem as to why Africa is increasingly becoming insolvent?
Well, I think it's a combination of problems. You know, from the discussion here, since I'm not an Africa expert, let's say, I have learned two things that are important. One, which is actually quite common with Latin America, particularly with South America, which is the effect of commodity prices. When commodity prices collapse, like we say, for example, copper, then you have to see how to manage both the external deficit, the balance of payment deficit, but also the fiscal implications that you will have. So that's one type of problems. But the others are the other problem is the fact that Sub-Saharan Africa started to get, let's say, bond and private financing on a larger scale. And let me say, even from the experience of Latin America, that's a complex issue. Right. How to get the good financing, but also how to manage over-indebtedness. Right. Well, and let me say another problem that is prominent is when there are international financial crisis of some sort, then the financing is cut and becomes more expensive. I mean, that has been quite clear since the issue of Ukraine, when the world inflation went up significantly, interest rate went up, and there was a cut in financing from the private sector to developing countries, and the financing that was available was very expensive. So the management of those private sector issues, which in a sense, in the case of Latin America, that goes back to, let's say, the 1970s, 1980s, but also recently. And then, of course, you can go back in history, for example, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, which was a huge problem. Yeah. But anyway, so it's how to manage private financing in a sustainable way, and to avoid or to manage the pro-cyclical problems associated with that financing. The fact that you get good financing during booms, you can get no financing or very expensive financing during crashes.
But we'll do a comparative analysis shortly and possibly pick some lessons from Latin America, where you have a vast experience on how they were able to turn the corner. But let's talk about the way this is all feeding into the global conversation of the need, not just for Africa, but the entire world, to consider repositioning the international financial architecture. Because some believe that that's where the solution lies, and we must start now.
Yeah. Well, let me say that in the discussions that were quite extensive last year, from the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the G20, the World Bank, etc., it is quite clear that there are many issues that have to be reformed in the international financial architecture. I think the greatest consensus I saw was in the role of the multilateral development banks. But interestingly, this issue of debt was not prominent in many of those discussions, or rather in many of those decision-making processes. When you see for example, I mean, there was, of course, the G20 launched this comprehensive framework. I mean, further debt suspension initiative during the COVID year, 2020, but at the end of that year, this common framework, which has been used by 4 African countries. But the common framework negotiations are very long, very extensive. They, getting everybody involved is extremely, or has not taken place. And even large creditors for Sub-Saharan Africa, official creditors, which is the role of China, right, don't participate necessarily in those processes, but want a separate process. So it has been a very complex process. And let me add to that in the G20 meeting in India last year, there was absolutely nothing new on that. Absolutely nothing. When you read the statement and the agreement of the heads of state of the G20, there is only one paragraph that just mentions the common framework, which is an inadequate mechanism, as we have seen. So it has to be significantly improved for Sub-Saharan Africa, but also for the middle-income countries that do not have access to the common framework.
If there's any challenge we're facing now, it's access to development financing. Some proposals have been put forward, for instance, from our president, who's a champion of the African Union institutions for financial reform. And the call partly is that we begin to invest much more of our sovereign reserves even in African institutions. The call to use, for instance, the AFDB and other multilateral institutions present here in Africa, so we are able to easily draw down when we're in crisis. Is that the solution to the challenge, or perhaps it's a more nuanced situation as you would want to?
Well, I think there are two problems that have to be managed in the case of official financing. Yeah. The first one is the one you mentioned at the end of your question, which is in our jargon of economics, counter-cyclical financing. So when crises come, as I said before, the private financing tends to be less available or not available, and therefore you need the development banking system and official development assistance to come in to support countries. The role of multilateral development banks is particularly important, but let me say in that regard that my research on that issue is that the World Bank has more or less done a good job in that regard, and particularly for poor countries during the recent crisis. But some of the regional development banks have not, and the African Development Bank was not very active during the crisis. So the countercyclical role has to be emphasized for the World Bank, but in here also for the African Development Bank. Okay, and even let me say for official development assistance, which is of course very important for sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the other issue is long-term financing. Long-term financing is very important. I mean, for many reasons, but I guess climate change is probably the most important individual issue that has to be managed. So, how to manage that, financing of climate change? When countries do not have the resources to do so, and they play an important role. I mean, all countries of the world play an important role. Of course, sub-Saharan Africa not because of consumption, but South America, for example, are important in natural resources, particularly forests. How to protect the forests is a very important issue, and again, in a way, how to finance, let's say, the green technologies for electricity generation, for cars, etc., etc. So that's a whole problem. Now, the consensus last year in this discussion of multilateral development banks is that multilateral development banks have to significantly increase their financing. Even the most conservative proposal was for this group of experts of the G20 said that it more has to triple by 2030, and the UN was even more ambitious than that. Anyway, but also that for these areas you have to have concessional financing, so financing which very long term, and with low interest rates. Now the question is. For that, you need official resources from developed countries to finance those concessional elements.
And I'm sorry, that's where geopolitics comes in, right? As we're seeing it play even across the African continent. You take the case of some African countries that are heading in for the IMF austerity plan. Zambia has been a perfect case of how increasingly there is some sort of a decline in consensus globally amongst the superpowers. What's your take on that? Do you feel that this increasing geopolitics is beginning to cripple the economic progress of African nations?
Well, let me say there are old problems there and new problems. The old problem is that that most countries don't even meet the Official Development Assistance Committee that they agreed in the United Nations decades ago, of 0.7% of gross national income in official development assistance. Very few countries meet that criteria, the United States being one of the worst, but also Japan is bad in that regard, and many European countries don't meet the commitment. That's one problem, and therefore there has to be a commitment to meet. Let's say in that regard, there are a few countries that have moved in the right direction. Actually, the United Kingdom being one of them. Now, but the other problem of geopolitics, let's say today, is that there is a lot of financing to let's say to certain conflicts are going on that are used, which means that the demand for those resources, I mean, particularly for Ukraine, is taking a significant amount of resources that have reduced the availability of financing. And let me say that the availability of resources is important also for the capitalization of the multilateral development banks, because without the capitalization, there is no way the multilateral development banks can increase the financing as the G20 expert group proposed. And that's a problem, plus the politics of this, notably in the case of the United States, where Congress is, let's say, is reluctant to capitalize multilateral development banks.
I see. The point about China and how China's influence has been growing on many of these African countries, even in terms of its sovereign debt renegotiations of such. I take, for instance, Ghana. 3/3 or 1/3 of our external debts owed to China. You have the same thing playing out for Zambia and other African countries that had a challenge doing their debt restructuring. We're still at that point now, even talking about Ghana, where just last week the IMF Chief Executive, Kristalina Georgieva, was here in Accra raising similar concerns about how the official creditors are still watching to see how it would go about the Eurobond restructuring. How do you feel that countries such as Ghana, can turn the corner and to deal with this challenge in a very tactful manner without throwing away what the official creditors are giving us?
No, one of the problems with official creditors, and this is not only China, but China is on board now in that regard, is that they don't want to see haircuts or reductions of the debts, which I think many sub-Saharan African countries do need a haircut. Is not the same debt that they can pay. In the case of China, I think there are two additional problems. The first is the interest rate they charge is higher than for example, the interest rates of the official financing of the developed countries or the multilateral development banks. And finally, but not less important, that they do not participate on an equal basis in the renegotiation process. They want to have their own process, which is sometimes also difficult. Let me say, I don't know how many cases of that there are in Africa, but let me say that in many cases, let's say the lending by China, for example, China Development Bank, is done on poor projects or poor initiatives, and therefore the quality of the investment that they finance is not good. Let's say in Latin America, for example, there was a huge problem in the lending to Venezuela by China, which was about half of the lending to Latin America went to Venezuela. Essentially, those projects got bad, and actually Venezuela, in retrospect, has to pay it in oil. Now, but you have Sri Lanka. That's another case in which there was massive financing from China that went bad.
And speaking about Sri Lanka, that's the fear that the worst might happen to some of these African countries facing a sovereign debt crisis. Judging from what happened there, learning lessons and comparing notes, what is critical now for African countries in terms of policy measures to immediately consider?
Well, I mean, there are domestic policy measures, but there are global policy issues. And I say there has to be, as I said yesterday in the conference, well, there has to be the creation of an institutional mechanism at the global level to renegotiate debts. That's one issue that has to be done, but it will take some time. But the other is an ad hoc mechanism. The most important for Sub-Saharan Africa was the multilateral debt relief that was agreed in 2005, and which essentially reduced the debt to almost nothing for several countries. I mean, it has been very clear in the presentations here, and there were more than 40% of low-income countries with debt over indebtedness back in the 1990s, and it went down to 5%. So it was a very successful. So something like that has to be adopted, which means that there has to be a debt relief on a one-time basis, let's say. I think that for Sub-Saharan Africa, actually, when you see the debt of Sub-Saharan Africa at the global level, that's a little amount of money compared to the global financial issues. So it should not be that difficult to adopt a very ambitious mechanism in that regard. So that's one. That's I think what has now. At the national level, you also need domestic restructurings. I mean, from the presentations, it is quite clear that some of the African countries have very low taxation. They have to increase taxation. But actually, there are many countries that give tax benefits to natural resource companies.
Right.
That's something
tax waivers, you mean? Yes.
Yeah, tax waivers. Yeah,
right.
that's unacceptable in my view. Actually, some of the natural resources should pay extra in terms of taxes. Because that's a natural resource that actually the countries lose when the exploitation of the minerals or oil takes place. So that's one point. But good taxation is one element, but also let's say good fiscal management in general. You cannot, you don't have enough taxes. You cannot increase government spending much. You have to take that into account. And let me say also that I like this idea from the Latin American history of the natural resources funds. Right. That was an old mechanism that Colombia used for coffee, but it's also a mechanism that Chile developed for copper. How does that work? Well, when there are booms in the prices of those commodities, there are savings that are done by the country, which the country can then use when the commodity prices fall. Right. So it's a good mechanism that I think should be developed in all commodity exporting countries.
Right. And as we wrap up our conversation, what we're doing now, and together with the experts that you're joining in Accra, is considered as a very timely intervention that will help spur growth across the African continent. The belief is that together with the experts like yourself and the others doing the conversations today, some solution of a sort will be developed. What's your expectation, going into these 3 days of talks, engagements around, the need to reform the international financial architecture, and what do you feel should be the end game?
Well, let me say that I already mentioned both the structural issue, but also the ad hoc or the emergency solution, which have to be part of this international financial architecture. And I hope the discussion gets into the main, into proposing a specific solution. I must say the African Union can play a fundamental role. It played a fundamental role in international taxation last year when it promoted the convention of the UN on international tax cooperation. Right. The same thing should be done. And now that the African Union is member of the G20, I think it's an additional opportunity in that regard.
Economist and a lecturer or new school and a war America Bridge minimum Professor John Kregel openye de atu edwa say yehwe Ghana ha say ya yenim si yakọ IMF ni nyina eye bosia bebrebe eno na amana basa wose senkiyam ye ni akọ ye climate change ana ewiem nsachaye ene se de yenye de no esiti a anke no betimi aboa ama bosia ene ye ka ye de bebre no yetimi adane titiru ni say yakọ IMF on ka senye ne mom si etimi tutu ye nioma yi a yeso so ye beboa ye ho ama dachi bia no ya de ye ho e de efira brofumpo ensem.
Low-income and middle-income African countries, at the same time that we have the challenge coming up of climate change. And climate change is going to require a great deal of expenditure. And the first problem that you have is trying to coordinate the response to the existing increasing debts with the increase in expenditures that you're going to have to undertake for climate change. So it's a question of trying to find out how you can ameliorate the negative impact of those debts on the African economies at the same time as trying to prevent the damage that's going to come from increasing climate change. Well, Ghana has a position of increasing debt, but Ghana is not alone, unfortunately. And for very many countries, in particular African countries, debts have been increasing over the last 2 or 3 years. Now, the basic reason for this is that after the pandemic and after the financial crisis in the United States, interest rates were kept at extremely low levels. So it was possible to borrow paying very low interest rates. Those interest rates started to change about 2.5, 3 years ago when inflation started to increase in the United States and in Europe. So you went from interest rates, policy rates, which were, well, we called them zero. They weren't quite zero, but they were very close to zero, to rates which are now in the range of 6%, 7%. Now, those are the risk-free rates that are charged in advanced developed countries. For developing countries, the rates have gone up much higher. So if you think of borrowing 100 cedis, I think is the name of the currency, you borrow 100 cedis at 1% interest rate, okay, your interest rate is, the interest payment that you have to make is 1 cedi. If it goes up to 10% or 12%, it suddenly goes to 12. And that's a big increase. And it's very difficult for countries to meet that debt service, so they have to borrow more simply in order to pay that higher interest. And that's why the total debt goes up.
Abusiafo yenkɔ ahoane so na ye ne nsentweni Bernard to ata eni enkomo. Asama beto ya apono so.
It's watching business at 2. Now, at a time when 24 of 55 African countries are in or at risk of debt distress, the International Development Economists Associates is urging African countries to spend borrowed funds on profitable ventures. Whilst the phenomenon of borrowing is not an entirely bad thing, Professor Adebayo Olukoshi holds the view that spending it on recurrent expenditure and wasteful endeavors has been the bane of the continent over the years.
Who goes borrowing in order just to consume? I mean, it's one thing to borrow. As a parent, you might borrow money in order to pay the school fees of your child. If you are going to borrow simply to buy iPhone 28, then I have to say that you are crazy. It's exactly the same situation with our countries. There are things, you see, the fact of borrowing itself is not a problem. It's what you do with it that ultimately matters. And nobody should teach you what is sustainable. You cut your coat according to your size. If you borrow a certain amount, you know that in 5 years' time, you can wipe it out by the benefits that come from the use to which you put the money. But if you borrowed it simply to distribute rice before an election, then the people will pay for it after the election.
Start today. First, fast, and credible.
Now, the minority in parliament has once again accused the senior presidential advisor and special envoy on international finance and private sector investment and former finance minister Ken Ofori-Atta for the hikes in public debt stock, attributing the latest increment to fiscal indiscipline. It follows recent revelation by the central bank that the country's debt stock has risen from 575 billion Ghana cedis in 2023 to 610 billion cedis in the first quarter of 2024. According to the minority, the biggest mistake a Akufo-Addo-led administration made was appointing Ken Ofori-Atta as a finance minister, arguing he was not fit for purpose. Ranking member of the Finance Committee of Parliament and Member of Parliament for Bogatanga Central, Isaac Adongo, spoke at the ongoing African debt crisis and the International Financial Architecture Conference here in Accra. Have a listen.
So this has been the song since
since Adam. Okay, so in the last debt crisis of Africa in the 70s and 80s, and even most recently in the 2000s when we undertook HIPIC, there were the same chorus that look, the global financial system is not favorable to Africa. The multilateralism is not favorable. Let me give you just one example. America can borrow up to a debt to GDP of 500%, but it will never default. You know why? Because the debt is in dollars and the American currency that they print from their central bank is in dollars. Okay? If Ghana decide to even borrow up to 70% of GDP and they give us the right to print our own money, we'll print cedis. But we don't owe in cedis, we owe in dollars. So that already should tell you that the multilateral environment is not supporting Africa. Largely because the systems are developed in such a way that the other side of the divide have certain opportunities inherent in the global financial system. If you decide that you are going to borrow on the international capital market, who are you borrowing from? You are borrowing from the same source, which is the dollar or the euro or the pound sterling. Now, when those monies come into your country, immediately they stabilize your currency. But remember that those monies are like tourists who have just come into your country. They will return where they belong. A dollar never stays in your country forever because it must go back to America. The euro must go back to Europe, and the pound sterling must go back to the UK. So if you decide that you are going to pump it into the economy and stabilize your currency like our central bank did when we were borrowing $3 billion and pumping out, the time has come for you to find those tourists and send them home, and they've deserted you. So how are you going to pay? Then the next thing is that you declare yourself bankrupt. You say, look, I can't pay. So we need to focus on how do we navigate the kind of multilateralism that we have, the kind of global financial architecture that we have, by ourselves helping ourselves to be prudent in the way we manage our resources, by making sure that when we go out to borrow, we are aware of the ramifications going forward.
Is it doable?
Of course it is doable. Why not? I mean, it is about having the political will to do it. If you, as a household, go to borrow money, you don't need anybody to tell you that you must work hard to pay it. It is all because we always have these conversations, and so we have a situation where we do not even assess the people we put into office. If you look at, and I've said, for instance, that the biggest mistake this country ever made was to put somebody like Ken Ofori-Atta in the office of the finance minister. He was completely not fit for purpose. He does not understand these type of conversations. He does not understand that when we are borrowing, it is not just because the market is available to you. The market is there to exploit you and collapse your economy. And you must be smart enough to use those monies that you borrow to build growth poles and generate the kind of resources that will allow you to pay for it. But this was somebody who was just interested in carrying data bank along and earning fees. And at the end of the day, in fact, when he borrowed, it was as if it was a success to borrow. You remember that? We celebrated it here with Kenke and Fish, as if we never pay. You understand? And you put that type of person as the finance minister. You ruin the whole country, you ruin the generations. And as we speak, Ghana is a laughing stock. We shouldn't be cited as an example in this type of fora. But remember, just sit here. Anytime, Ghana is a pivotal example. And that is an embarrassment. You see, for every country, the biggest respect that you have is your sovereignty. And your sovereignty is what you use to guarantee for loans. And when you borrow, you say you cannot borrow, you break that trust and you convert all your nationals, okay, all your nationals into men of straw. And nobody respects a man of straw. And that's where we are now. Whether you like it or not, you are. Anywhere we mention our name, we are embarrassed. When you go to IMF, World Bank meetings, and they are citing examples of countries that have defaulted and that are in dire straits, and we must learn not to be like they are. Ghana is an example.
So you had the ranking Member of Parliament Select Committee on Finance and Member of Parliament for Bolgatanga Central, Isaac Adongo. Now, on his part, economist Professor Adebayo attributed unsustainable debt level among African countries to some finance ministers and governors of central bank who act as brokers in procuring loans.
The second component of financialization is the emergence into significant prominence of speculation, just simply speculating. For example, on the CD, and saying that in 12 months we expect that the CD will be exchanged to the US dollar or the pound sterling at this rate. And then they put money behind that speculation to make it happen, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when the speculation works, they go to their bank smiling with tons of profit. Now, it's the same kind of speculation. Let me give you the example of George Soros. George Soros, the international financier based in the US and founder of the Soros Foundation, who took a bet, a speculative bet against the British pound sterling during the period of Mrs. Thatcher. And he took a bet that the pound sterling would be devalued. And those who took that bet, they controlled money. And they moved money in a direction that forced the British Chancellor of the Exchequer to devalue the pound sterling. And Mr. Soros alone made a profit of £2 billion and then set up a foundation, right? So we are dealing with a season of powerful speculative forces at play. Thirdly, they are backed by consultancy firms, global consultancies that include lawyers, tax specialists, safe haven specialists, accountants, all kinds of people whom they recruit into a global consultancy network that also incorporates many domestic actors in our countries. Domestic actors to which I will include some of our finance ministers and central bank governors, who sometimes also own their own consultancy companies and begin to act as brokers in the process of procuring loans. And as a broker, plays in our sovereign debt situation, where those who are in these consultancy companies play the role of arranging one aspect or the other. Some of them are lawyers who simply draft agreements. Some of them are accountants who provide fiduciary data and information. But whatever role they play, they get a cut from the loan. So you take a loan of 1 billion from Eurobond, the actual amount that will come to you ultimately will be less than 1 billion.
Economist Professor Adebayo Olukoshi there ending that particular report.